welcome you to this edition, which promises to be extraordinary. Mostly because this market is so interesting, so developed, so progressive, and so advanced. There's no doubt about it that the UK legal market is on average ahead of the curve when it comes to the use and implementation of legal technology. We have an extraordinary group of speakers with us today, for which we're very grateful for their time and their expertise in this discussion. Just a few statistics about the UK. Many of you from the UK who are our guests today, but just some interesting perspective of law firms and the legal tech sector in particular. We know that the UK has the second largest legal services sector in the world, second only to the US. According to the UK Law Society, the legal services sector contributes almost £60 billion in gross value added to the UK economy each year and supports around 552,000 full-time employees. In 2019, over £61 million was invested in law tech, compared to just 2.5 million in 2016. So that gives you an idea of the growth in monetary terms about the investment in law tech literally over that short period of time. But the size of law tech is hard to determine. According to an article in the FT in October last year, a list compiled by Stanford University featured nearly 1,250 legal technology companies in the UK, while a startup map put together by Legal Geek which runs law tech events, included more than 250 from across Europe. So it is hard to pinpoint the number, but it is burgeoning. There's no doubt about that. 48% of global law tech funding is invested in the UK. So I think that is an extraordinary statistic as well. According to a survey by PwC in 2019, 38% of the top 100 law firms predicted that AI would be the most disruptive technology in the sector over the next 5 years. That compared with process automation at 16%, blockchain and smart contracts at 9%, and data and analytics also at 9%. AI had started to mature. Most in the top 100 firms, 50% had established it and 50% were piloting. Although smart contracts were less mature in those firms, 0% had established it at that time, but 70% were piloting. That compared to AI, for 16% for AI and 11% for smart contracts established across the top 10 to 11 100 firms. Thomson Reuters in April 2019 in an article said that law firms in London and the greater UK endeavour to take more chances than any other part of the world. So it's on that basis that we're here in London, an extraordinary market, a fantastic panel of speakers moderated by Rachel Pether and Dilip Masan from our partner in this, Phoenix Advisors. And on that note, Rachel, I'll turn over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Linda, and there's certainly some impressive statistics for the UK legal market. As many of you know, this is part of a series. It's our 5th event for the Knowledge Series, with the previous being Mumbai, Riyadh, Lagos, and New York. And thank you so much for joining our special London edition. I'd like to thank our partners, of which Linda is one, at the ADGM Arbitration Centre, and also Phoenix Advisors, and we'll be hearing from Dilip shortly. We apologise for any confusion over the timing for this event. We were a bit caught out by daylight saving over the weekend, but as Nick pointed out to us earlier, the machines are smarter than us, so you all should have had the right time in your calendar at least. Now, the sort of premise of this is it's really a discussion. We want you, the audience, to be engaged. So if you have any questions for our panelists throughout the session today, please just enter them in the Q&A section on your big marker screen. And you can also upvote questions from other audience members, so please feel free to do so. We will be releasing polling questions throughout just to test your engagement. And I'd like to release the first polling question now. As which player in the legal industry do you think is best poised to gain the most advantage from legal tech in the next 5 years. Now, co-moderating this session with me today will be Dilip Masand, my dear friend and the co-founder of Phoenix Advisors. So Dilip, I'll hand over to you to introduce our fabulous panelists.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I have to say, I feel like I'm a bit of a placeholder between my great collaborators, Linda, Rachel, and this incredibly diverse and talented group of panelists that we have today, who can truly speak about transformation in the legal industry from unique perspectives, that of an investor, that of a law firm, and that of a legal tech entrepreneur. So before we begin, let me share a little bit with you about their backgrounds and their bios. Susan Dunn is the head of litigation funding at Harbor Litigation Funding. She has been described as the doyenne of litigation funding, having established her first funder in 2002. She has provided significant input to the development of public policy on third-party funding around the world and was a founding member of the UK's Association of Litigation Funders, which she now chairs. Julia Solaski is the founder and CEO of Legal, a platform that gives law firms the tools to succeed in a digital-first world. Julia's first company, Crowd Justice, enabled thousands of people to obtain legal services when they weren't necessarily able to afford so. She has been recognized by the Financial Times as Legal Innovator of the Year and was previously a lawyer at Linklaters and the United Nations. And Nick West is the Chief Strategy Officer at Mishcon de Reya and one of the foremost experts in legal tech. At Mishcon, he has established one of the industry's first in-house data science and machine learning teams and is also the director of MDR Lab, a program for tech startups in the legal space. In 2018, Nick was named one of the 24 evangelists for change in the legal sector by The Lawyer magazine. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Nick. Welcome to the Knowledge Series. We're really looking forward to this discussion. Rachel, back to you.
Thanks so much, Dilip. For the first question, we'd like to start with you, Susan. As Dilip mentioned, you've been a leader in litigation funding for many years now, having established your first fund back in 2002. So maybe we can just start, if you can compare now and then to the approach and also some of the challenges to the funding industry, particularly in the use of technology. And I'll just refer back to the first polling question. We actually had only 4% of the audience saying that litigation funding was poised to receive the most advantage from legal tech within the next 5 years. So maybe you could sort of weave that into the answer as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you for the kind introduction. And it's lovely to see everybody and everybody who's out there in the virtual audience. It's interesting, looking back over 18 years of funding, and there's things that haven't changed at all, and some things that you sort of forget have changed along the way. So what hasn't changed at all is we look for exactly the same things as we've always looked for in a case, which is how's the other side going to pay? What's this claim worth? How much is it going to cost? And what are the legal merits? And when you hear those four things, you can understand that technology could have a role to play in each one of those, whether it's the use of technology to find out information about the defendants, whether it's the use of technology for the valuing of the claim or finding any predictable aspects around values of claims. And in terms of the costs, the use of technology to look at past budgets to help predict future budgets, and then the use of technology for trying to determine outcomes on cases, the bit that I think a lot of people think that funders start with first, which is the legal merits, which we don't. We start with the economics, do the economics work, and then we can decide whether we think the legal merits work or not. And it's interesting to hear that only 4% of litigation funders gain from the technology piece. I think, look, what do we do for a living? We pay bills. I think people get very excited sometimes about the role of litigation funding, but that's fundamentally what we do once we have agreed to fund a case. And I look back to the very early days of the tiny funder that I had and how we used very rudimentary. We tried to keep trying to use, at that stage, very rudimentary tools to sort of score aspects of a case and do all sorts of things to try and come up with an outcome. And those outcomes were always way off compared with the analysis that we did. And in part, that's because we tended to look at smaller cases then, but increasingly larger one-off cases which have very unique characteristics that are difficult to get any kind of meaningful data set to then use to evaluate. And I know we'll come on to talk about that in a bit, but that is one of the key aspects. Is if you only have a data set of 4 about a judge's prediction of an outcome on a case, that isn't really that meaningful. It's only when you start getting into the thousands of outcomes that you can look at some of the predictions that come from it. But what is very clear is, and the way we're behaving here today, is that this is the thing that is that nudge theory thing that gets people using technology more. We've all become very comfortable with doing this. We'd rather not do it all the time because we quite like seeing each other in person. But this has made us more comfortable with, I think, looking at the tools, and no doubt Nick will have some things to say about that and how it's worked within a big law firm. But I think it's the data that underlies the technology, and that's always critical, no matter what the tool. That you have to have that to make things meaningful. So whilst there are a lot of things around at the moment which look and sound very useful, without data to populate them, they only have a limited use in terms of, certainly for us, our ability to predict things. But I will just, before I stop this sort of introductory piece, I will just say one thing, though, is that it is all about the law firms adopting it. And I remember one partner in a well-known law firm who, when I was asking them about how they predicted the budgets on cases going forward and how much analysis they did of their estimates versus actuals in the past, and this partner rather airily said to me, "I'm not paid to look backwards." Well, without looking backwards at what we have learned to populate how things look going forward, we never make any progress. Technology can't fix us if we don't agree to start populating things. So that, for me, is at the core of all of this. And I think we, in the end, are, as funders, beneficiaries if people just start to do more of that. Because the more we look at how right or wrong we were in the past, the more we get better at how we predict things in the future. And that, for me, is at the heart of this discussion.
Thank you, Susan, for that. I think the point you make about what's really useful is a very good point, given how much is out there. And with that, Nick, I'd like to ask you, as one of the foremost experts in legal tech, what have you sought to change in the way law is practiced and delivered to the client? And what do you think have been game-changing strategies for clients in the way you've deployed innovative technologies in your firm?
Thanks, Dilip. I think the root of the answer to this question is really about understanding client desires. Everything we do, we're a professional services firm. If we think broadly across the industry, that's what we do. We help clients get outcomes. So I think everything has to start there. What Mishcon needs to deliver to our kind of clients will be different from the next firm. But once we know what our clients want, and to be honest, they don't really care much about tech. It's not to say they're not tech interested. They don't really care about the tools with which we do our job. They want the outcome, the business outcome. I think that's the number one starting point. What we then do is we then sort of have as you said, a range of different strategies. We think differently about the business of law. And what I mean by that is the way that we as a firm, operate our business with our client as the buyer. So everything's around trying to give the client the best client experience. Whether it's we now effectively onboard all of our clients digitally. So they no longer do they have to come into the office to deliver us a passport. Those kind of things clearly improve for the vast majority of our clients. They materially improve the onboarding experience, and we've done the same with all sorts of finance processes and marketing processes and so on. And then we make a distinction between that and then the practice of law. And the practice of law is what the lawyers do to actually do the legal work. And there, actually, a lot of what I was thinking about saying, as Susan's actually really, said, an awful lot of that is around data, is around our ability to manipulate large data sets. Whether we're talking about, in litigation, a disclosure exercise or trying to investigate the early stages of a case, or whether we're talking about transaction and trying to, look through a large diligence exercise or whatever it might be. A lot of what we're doing there, a lot of the strategy is around being able to work with and synthesize, a lot of data quickly, be very efficient in how we push and pull data and how we do specific tasks, and then think quite carefully about how we actually use that data to help make better decisions or present information to clients in a way that is simple. So I think actually, again, for me, and this is this is not a planned thing. I think if you're asking for the one biggest thing, it really is about data. It's about how we have a real drive to make data the heart of our business. So that's probably been the biggest thing we've focused on over the past few years.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Nick. And I think we'll dive a bit deeper into some of those issues around data and what it can best be used for shortly. But Julia, would like to go to you now. Now, as Dilip mentioned, you've worked as a lawyer at the UN and also the Magic Circle firm. What led you to leave those environments and pursue a career in the startup and entrepreneurial world? I know you've set up 2 companies now, Crowd Justice and Legal. So maybe you could explain what they do and what you're hoping to achieve with both.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks also for having me. So I guess, why did I decide to leave? I think as a lawyer, I think one of the difficult transitions is from going from a lawyer to being an entrepreneur is around risk. And I think as a lawyer, I was probably more on the risk hungry side than on the overly cautious side, and it meant that I felt a little bit stunted in terms of what I thought I wanted to do professionally and what I could achieve in the legal context. When I moved from Magic Circle firm to the UN, I was working on a project around online dispute resolution. So how do you resolve disputes online cross-border? And it was 150 government lawyers talking about what was a really important topic, but quite a politically charged topic in many ways, perhaps unexpectedly so, and also something that really touched on technology, which when you're looking across the global spectrum, everyone has different views as to how that should work. And I thought, from my own perspective, just having a kind of bias to action in general, was thinking a lot about online dispute resolutions attempting to solve real problems that real people face. And at a UN level, you can do that to some extent, but I thought that on the ground, there was really an opportunity to change the way, whether in a small way or big way, that people access legal services. So Crowd Justice, my first business, is really around trying to leverage technology to create communities around funding. So sort of the inversion almost of traditional litigation funding, which is donation-based online funding for legal matters. Through Crowd Justice, what we started to see and what we started to dig into, which touches actually quite a lot on both what Susan and Nick have said, is around by operating in the space where you're changing the revenue models for firms. Started doing one of the things Susan said is, like, in litigation funding, traditional litigation funding, you look at the unit economics first. And we started to see that for a lot of the firms that we were working with at Crowd Justice, the unit economics of their business didn't necessarily work. And that's for a lot of consumer facing matters. But when we started really digging into that, it became clear to me and to my team, there was a really big adjacent opportunity to look at one of the things Nick has said, which is around the digitization or the creation of better efficiencies and better business models, not in the substantive delivery of legal services, but in the business operations that go around that. So in terms of data, which both Susan and Nick have mentioned, I think the thing that we see very consistently, and most of our customers are in the sort of mid to upper mid-market sort of space, is that data is something that people really want to be able to use. They really want it to inform business decisions. They really want to take the kind of unit economics of their existing legal matters and improve those. But they often A, lack the data around that, or B, don't know how to use it effectively. So I think there's 2 frameworks, and one is around how do you deliver legal services really beautifully and efficiently, both to give your client a good experience, but also to increase as a firm your profitability. And then second, and more, I think, along the lines of what Susan Mick have also touched on, is how do you use data to make the substantive legal services you're delivering more predictable, more transparent. So that's sort of where I come at this from.
That's fabulous. Thanks so much, Julia. No, I think that's interesting that you're bringing this perspective, as Nick mentioned, on both the business of law and also the practice of law.
So I think at this stage, we're going to open it up a little bit. And this will be a question for all of you, and to look at from your specific area of expertise. What do you currently see as the main issues or stumbling blocks in the use of legal tech? I know we've discussed this a little bit. Is it perhaps a poor quality of data to predict reliable outcomes, or slow uptake by law firms in the wider use of technology? Susan, maybe we could start with you again on this, and Julia, Nick, please feel free to jump in when you can, or as you like.
Yeah, look, I think there's a variety of things going on. I mean, one of the things I always find surprising is I sort of think the older I get, that then when I look to those younger than me, that they're all going to behave in a much more forward-looking way than me, and there's sort of some of the dinosaurs that might have been ahead of me will go. And I'm surprised when that isn't always the case. There is a mixed outlook amongst age groups about the usage. Inevitably, the younger lawyers are much more tech content to use, but I still see quite a lot of resistance. And I think, unfortunately, at the moment, that I have some sympathy with. It's a bit like the Betamax VHS video situation. That the risk was that you ended up with the wrong format, and you were the one holding the redundant system, and everybody else has got the one that works, and therefore you're sort of the paralysis of indecision that comes along because you're afraid that you don't pick the leader, and therefore people are sort of sitting and waiting to see, well, what is going to be the default thing that everybody uses, and therefore everybody gets happy with. It also, I worked for a while with in government, trying to put government services online with the .com in the early 2000s, which went the way of all .coms, or almost all .coms, in that it did not succeed because we were too far ahead of our time with what we were trying to get government to do. And I think that there's a risk that people sort of feel, they forget how it's a weird thing to me, they sort of forget how their day-to-day work works when they then come to procure technological solutions, and they become two different people. It's like in their day-to-day activity, they do this core set of activities. When they come to procure an IT solution, it's like they want 78 different functionalities, even though they don't use those. And so they end up going for things which are overly complicated and then complicated to get into, and don't enable themselves to then focus on, well, what are the key things? We all know how we use our inbox, our email solutions or whatever. It's a pretty core set of activities. So I think we get a bit bamboozled about what it is that we need, and we don't start from there. And I think that's what is thwarting people taking these things on. Then, of course, there's the cost of what goes with it, and then how meaningful that solution is going to be. So I know it's very easy to say, but it is those solutions which, if we look at what are the things we feel most familiar with, well, they were mostly made easy for us to use, and recognize that actually we're quite simple folk with attention deficit on many fronts, and therefore provide the things which only do a few things really well, like a restaurant that has a very short menu but does everything brilliantly. That's sort of what you're looking for, but people forget that's what they want.
I was gonna say something similar, but for me, one of the biggest problems, and it picking out one of the themes of Susan's answer, is that people jump to solutions before they understand the problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
I see it. I mean, it happens every single day. I see it happening all the time. So either they come at it from they just haven't articulated it properly, and therefore they don't know what the 2 or 3 things the solution needs to do, and that's where they get confused with the 78 that Susan sort of mentioned. Or they've seen a fancy bit of tech, and so they go looking for a problem that it might solve. And the reality is that we, in a world, I know today a lot of this is around technology, but technology is only ever a component of the solution, right? Sometimes the problem that you have may be far better off solved without any technology. It might just be a sort of change in a process, or a person that's currently doing something does something else. So that to me is the biggest stumbling block and biggest issue I encounter on a daily basis.
Julia, what about you? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a number of thoughts on this. I guess, like, to sort of distill them into two, I would say, what kind of from a solutions perspective, what we've done in my business in a really conscious way is try to replicate existing, like digitize existing processes rather than force behavior change. And we see that is much easier than trying to tell people that there's a better way of doing things. But just actually, you can do the exact same thing, but you don't have to do as much work to do it, is an easier sort of sale. Mm-hmm. The second piece, and I think legal technology, when we think of law firms as, you know, as businesses, as they are. But I think a lot of law firms don't think of themselves as businesses, and a lot of vendors don't necessarily think of law firms as businesses, which operate potentially slightly differently than a traditional corporate structure. And the implication of that from an adoption perspective is that getting individuals in a partnership to adopt and also encourage adoption is really different than encouraging adoption of a technology tool in a sort of more traditional corporate structure is my opinion. And I think one of the things that sort of results from that is that a lot of technology doesn't get the firm-wide adoption that it needs to succeed. And it's quite, you know, if you don't use something in the firm, or you have only one or two advocates for it, it can be really hard to make that like a really core part of your day-to-day. And the knock-on consequences of that are potentially disastrous for real tech adoption.
And don't forget, you know what lawyers are like. The lawyers love to say what's wrong with something. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast, right? You know, it's just who we are. And you're like, yeah. So that's the cultural issue that we're dealing with.
For sure.
So you're
That's
basically risk-averse drama queens.
That's a great quote, Rachel.
Yeah, I like that.
So it's interesting what you're saying, because I'm just looking at the responses to the polling question about what's holding back the adoption, and more than 70% said it was either skepticism about its benefits or lack of knowledge on how to implement it. But it seems like what you're all saying is that people have this tendency, whether it's psychologically or whatever, to bite off more than they can chew. So maybe it's almost like the solutions creating the problem in some ways. And Julia, you actually mentioned, you know, the sort of blurring of lines that you're getting, you know, with like alternative legal service providers or consulting firms and technology firms offering legal services. I'd love to get all of your views on whether, you know, this creates value for clients, or is it creating a greater risk of conflicts like data breaches, etc. Maybe you could discuss that about the blurring of lines as well.
In terms of like more competition in the provision of legal services from other providers.
Yeah, so like consulting firms and technology firms that aren't lawyers offering technology solutions to lawyers.
I think also offering legal services. I mean, what we're seeing now with these alternative legal service providers are technology firms. Nick, you're probably competing with some of them. Julia, you're competing with some of them. Consulting firms offering legal services. So, you know, these lines are blurred. I mean, is there value in that? Does it create conflicts of interest? And is it just bells and whistles at the end of the day? You know, marketing, frankly.
Personally, I think competition in the legal sector is really, really healthy, and I think it gives more choice. It creates more opportunities for a technology adoption, and but because people are having to compete more aggressively and the market becomes more competitive, it means that people have to think of better ways to do their work, and both on the business operation side and on the substantive legal delivery side. It's better for consumers, whether the consumer is an actual consumer or a corporate. I think since the introduction of ABS in, I think it's 2007, I think the market has evolved much more rapidly post 2007 than in like the 50 years pre 2007 because of that competitive pressure.
I agree. I think people forget how, you know, in the 70s, 80s, you know, pricing was largely on scale kind of prices. You couldn't market. I mean, this was it's not exactly the most forward-looking industry in the world, but it used to be incredibly different. And so much has changed when you look at it over some big, some big time blocks. Clearly, I'm not suggesting in any way that there's not room for a lot more change. But I'm with Julia. I think particularly for clients who are able to, and I'll be a bit careful what I say, but who are able to disaggregate pieces of work and think about, how do I get this best done? You know, what's the balance between the kind of price and speed and quality? How do I weigh those things up? The greater number of options, the better that must be for a client. I mean, it must suit them. And the trick, when I sit there with my law firm hat on, is to think about making sure we understand which bit of that space we are best able to serve, and don't get confused by trying to serve a bit that we're not so good at doing. Right? You know, if I try and, in case it's not entirely obvious what I'm saying, I could go and get a steak at a restaurant or via Deliveroo, or go and buy one at a supermarket. They're just different service offerings in all three. And sometimes I want, one or the other, right? And I have to, that's what buyers are increasingly able to do. And there's frankly some way to go for the buyers to be more sophisticated, but they are getting more sophisticated, and different funding options or different ways to execute just increase the sophistication of the market and the choice available for the buyer. It must be a good thing.
That, I think, is actually a good segue into one of the questions from our audience, and in the spirit of interactive dialogue. We have a question from Sorcha Boyce. What other profession or industry do you think the legal profession could learn the most from right now in terms of its technology adoption journey? So we're talking about consulting and other industries encroaching on the legal industry. Who could the legal industry look to as sort of a forerunner and follow the practices of adoption in that industry? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we come back a bit, don't we, still to the you've got to start from it's know your audience. And so it's in a way, lawyers hate to admit they don't know something, right? We feel like we're meant to know the answer to everything. So I see this constantly, that they're afraid, and as a funder, what I do is I liberate them when I go into a room, because I can ask any question I like. It's okay. And you can see that little relief in the shoulders of people. Sometimes I go, thank God she's asked that question, because I haven't got a clue what's going on here. And so we don't want to make them look at it, say, go and look at the gaming industry, because gosh, haven't they done well? Because that's so far away from how they are. So I'm not sure there's anything. One of the things, it's not technology, but I'm always really impressed by the airline industry, how it deals with accidents, and that whole approach of, and they've developed some of this in the health system, which is, we want a no blame culture. We want to learn from this accident and what went wrong so that we all get better. And there is still a little bit of a tendency in the legal profession to sort of like, oh, you did that wrong, as opposed to, well, why did you get that wrong? And how can we avoid that happening again in the future? And so I think if we're going to go and look at how it's got to feel a bit like people like us, that little PLUs thing, to make us feel like they're people who understand. Because again, there's that little bit of a tendency sometimes in the legal profession to go, oh, you just don't understand how difficult it is. It's like if we have a justice minister who isn't legally qualified, there's a lot of snootiness that goes on, I just don't understand my world. And it's about trying to just do something which shows you understand whilst getting to adopt a solution. But I'm not sure I don't have enough experience, apart from anything else, of other industries to say, well, gosh, they've done well, haven't they? But I suspect there are some that you lot would know better than me, where you think actually that they would do well to look at them and see how well they've done.
On my end, I think the legal industry in kind of the similar ways as Susan is describing it's of course it's not unique, but I think a lot of at the kind of public policy level, people look at fintech as the analogy, but in fact, fintech is so different because people are, there's a lot of like highly commoditized services. There's a lot of like high volume transactions. And I think if you look at other regulated adjacent industries to the legal industry, like, real estate or tax and accountancy, I mean, these are not the kind of real estate, maybe slightly more, but like in general, there's not, when people are delivering specialized services, and in law where human relationships are so prized, even if they're not necessarily the be all and end all in terms of how you actually deliver legal services, but the nature of like human advice is so sought after, and that's what people are paying for. I think it's hard to see like a direct analogy with another industry, and I don't think fintech is quite right, maybe save for the fact that some of the big banks see the competitors coming up and either try to emulate them, try to buy them, that there's a lot more, I think, engagement with like some of the big banks and fintech and like, in incumbent kind of players and new players to try and have some synergies or competitions, but in terms of the services they're delivering, they are really quite different.
And Julia and Nick, I guess a question for both of you. Because how the Big Four is trying to compete on legal services, do either of you look at them and think they're doing a better job on adoption of technology than law firms that any of us could learn from?
I think one of the things that I'll give you the proper answer to that in a sec, but I think one of the things that we're in danger of doing, and it's not a criticism of this call, but is the legal industry isn't a homogeneous industry. I mean, that's the thing. So we have to sort of make sure we're talking about, so it's relevant for this point. There are some things that the Big Four do really well as they begin their, second or third coming or fourth coming or whatever it is into the legal market. And they have, a bunch of capabilities from their audit and tax and consulting practices that they, some of the ways they serve clients is far more sophisticated than law firms. Their ability to do certain types of work. Let me not go into the detail. That I think they're very attractive. In other segments of the market, they're just not a relevant comparison set at all. So yeah, I think we have to be mindful when we're answering the question. I kind of, this is Sorka's original question. And by the way, hi Sorka, we used to work at Axiom together. So, I find it really difficult to pick an industry. I think what, I like personally to do is to spend time looking at what in other industries in general are doing. And, whether, as you said, Susan, it's the airline industry, I'm fascinated by the way they do pricing, for example, or whether it's the retail industry and the way that they have to, because it's so cutthroat. They have to evolve their business models much faster than we do, or whatever it might be. And I find myself, if it's not too trite, at a point, I read Wired magazine, and I find my my brain just firing off little thoughts. Go, I wonder whether you could apply that to our industry. That I think, being a student of transformation, of progress in other industries as a whole. There's a lot for us to learn, and it's important that, again, we recognize that it isn't one big industry. There are so many different parts to it. The actual solution or the actual progress in one bit may be completely irrelevant for another.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Nick. And Julia, you did bring up fintech as well. And if you're looking at this, there's a lot of discussion about how much should we regulate fintech. So I'd also like to know the views of all of you on regulating legal tech innovation, and how much oversight do you think there should be at the regulatory level, given, confidentiality and data and things like that?
Of law tech specifically?
Yes, correct.
So I guess I'm more of a libertarian than I realize. I mean, law firms are super highly regulated. The legal industry is super. We don't need specific regulation about law tech. We don't regulate. We don't regulate Microsoft Word, right? I mean, it's just a tool that lawyers use, as long as the entity, and by that, thinking broadly, there are some entities that one could argue should fall into the regulation kind of remit, and some that probably should be outside of it, because, we still got quite an old-fashioned regulatory definition of who should be regulated and so on. But if you leave that bit aside and ask the question, should law techs be regulated? I think our rules on who should and shouldn't be regulated are already clear enough. Let's just crack on with that.
I think there's also like a really interesting kind of, I don't know if it's like a wave that will crest at some point, but I think there is a lot of innovation which does have an impact on end users, whether those be consumers or businesses, that isn't fully understood by the regulator at this stage. And so that's everything from like the digital, like purely digital delivery of legal services, which isn't currently regulated necessarily, to things like the way that smart contracts might work in future, to the way that like there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on at the cutting edge of tech. And I think ideally it's never going to be, hindered by regulation. But I do think there's a lack of real understanding on the part of regulators of like, what is the future? If consumers are buying their services from tech companies, which aren't regulated, power to them. But like, my personal preference is always that there's some level of foresight around that, so that if something goes wrong, which it invariably will, that the response is not to clamp down on it, but to actually understand what are the positive implications, what are the risks, are we regulating appropriately? Because I think what might happen is that this, technology moves quickly, consumers actually move quickly, the regulator doesn't move so quickly, and then there's like a fear knee-jerk response. Which hopefully won't happen, but I think the regulators in the UK are trying really hard to be tech forward, but it's quite hard to like have people from non-technical backgrounds really trying to stay abreast of like developments and stay one step ahead or even one step behind those developments.
I think the LawTech UK entity that has been created is trying to do quite a lot around that at the moment. There's quite a lot of effort around. So for anyone who doesn't know, it's a sort of government-backed approach to driving forward LawTech in the UK. There are other similar things around the world, but in the UK, it's called LawTech UK. And one of their big goals at the moment is to deliver a sort of easier access to regulators and for innovators. And there'll actually be quite a lot of information put into the public domain about that in the next month or so.
Do you think it's not so much a matter of the regulator's role, but perhaps the courts or ruling by precedent or, on a case-by-case basis? For instance, Susan, I remember a while ago, there was that matter in France, I think, where they were mining data as to decisions made by district court judges, and then a funder was trying to use that data. And then there was a prohibition that if that data is, being used, it's a €5 million fine. So, I'm just curious, do you think it's a matter of sort of case by case, defining boundaries, guidelines, et cetera, as opposed to blanket regulation?
Well, look,
in terms of the use of data.
I'm wholly with Nick. I think law firms are so regulated. If they make a mistake or there's some breach of confidentiality because of the solution they chose to buy, that's their problem. So they have to be very, very careful about these things. That's the heart of what they do. I thought funny, I've written that down as one of my notes, is the French thing. When I was just thinking about this, because I found that bemusing. If all you are doing is taking public decisions and seeing if there's any conclusions you can draw from them, I just don't get it. It seems extraordinary to me. And it had a sort of slightly, snooty feel about it, to say, well, how terribly precious of you. But you've created these decisions, they're publicly available. What on earth is wrong with then figuring out if there's any answer to any of that? Isn't that what we as lawyers in the widest capacity are here to do, is to try and give our clients the best indicators of whether their case is going to succeed? So I thought that was outrageous, actually, to do so. And I think this notion of the extent of any regulation, I don't understand it. If the purchasers of it are the law firms, then that's where your regulation already sits. And if somebody chooses to do something outside of that regulation, well, then yes, there's some education that needs to go on, as there does with clients generally. But if you choose to go to somebody who hasn't got a practicing certificate or whatever, because they're only £10 an hour, then you just are they alert enough to know what they're getting, claims management companies, for example, do particular things, they are now regulated, and that gives an element of protection because they are not law firms, and making sure that people behave in that way. But just because of buying a solution, I don't, to Nick's point, you don't regulate the Amazon tech solution for your storage, because it's up to you. If you buy something which is leaky and things, if a law firm has a breach of confidentiality, they are dead to their clients, because that is a terrible, terrible thing to happen to.
But again, I mean, with the point that this is multiple different parts of the market, you can see where it's important. If the general population, if the public at large are able to access stuff, then that needs to be carefully thought through. And that's where you come back to the much bigger question of what is actually regulated or not. So, whether you could make something up where you could log on to a tool that would somehow purport to advise you on the terms for your employment contract or whatever it might be, because it had just it had done an analysis of lots of employment contracts and was trying to, so clearly that needs to be thought through in some way. But actually, in truth, that's not the technology, that's the service that's being put into the market. That one has to decide whether that's acceptable or not. And I think I don't know, I think Julia was touching on it, this digital delivery of legal services, the regulatory environment is a bit, it's a bit old fashioned, frankly, what we have now. So
we've actually had another question coming in from the audience as well, from Jane Elizabeth Lambert. Thanks for your question, Jane. She said, can you give a practical example of the application of data and litigation from the moment the client comes into the solicitor's office?
Oh, yeah.
For example, a dispute over the terms of a patent license that has to be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory.
Yeah, I'm certainly happy to say that on. It's not, I don't know much about patent litigation. I don't know much about any litigation, actually, but I think, things you could do. So the minute the client walks in terms of using, if I ignore sort of data that gets used in all sorts of ways to onboard a client, but if I'm talking about litigation data, then a sort of very data forward organization would be using previous data from their own databases, from their own financial systems, to think through how much that piece of work was likely to cost. And to prepare a budget. So instead of a lawyer who might have 5 or 10 or 20 examples to base a budget on, the firm may have 100 or 500 or however many. So you may begin to augment the decision making of the individual lawyer to produce that first budget. As you go through, you may be thinking about, as you're advising the client, so both thinking about the budget or thinking about the strategy for the case, you may be using some more statistical data to try to understand whether, does patent litigation tend to settle or does it tend to go to trial? Does patent litigation, if it does go through the court system at all, does it tend to be, finish on summary judgment, or does it go? I mean, these are the kind of things that a bit generic, because obviously it's going to depend on the specifics. But those kinds of quite macro trend information, statistical analysis would lead you to be able to inform the conversation you had with a client more. And then you can begin to get into some of the stuff that Susan mentioned earlier on, which is, if when you get to the case management conference and you knew what judge that you had, you could start to look at the way the judge sort of interpreted similar matters. Or you could think about settlement values, or again, not settlement, you could think about awards that were likely to come and therefore use that to benchmark your settlement and so on. So there are lots of different things. And frankly, the data in the UK, Susan alluded to it earlier on, the data in the system, or that's made available from the court system in the UK, is appalling. And so therefore it's hard to do a lot of this stuff I'm talking about, or rather, it takes a lot of effort to do it. So only a few people are really working hard at it, and most people, we're not like the US market, where some of this data is much more readily available, and therefore all sorts of technology software players have built on top of that data to offer solutions. But I think there are, that's a handful of ways in which you could, in theory, use data. I'm sure there are a dozen others as well.
On that point that you just made about the data being appalling, will you maybe talk a bit more about that? And I'd love to get the views from the other panelists. Like, why is this, and is it sort of appalling globally, or it's just the UK specifically, and why is it lagging if it is behind the rest of the world?
I have to be very, very careful what I say here. It's not a global phenomenon. It's you know, I'm specifically referring to the UK. What is it? It's a combination of, you know, we're using infrastructure that was built many, many years ago that doesn't have sort of central technology backbones that make it very easy to sort of make data accessible. There hasn't been, you know, it hasn't been made a priority. There are some very difficult political decisions. You know, Susan was talking about this French situation. You know, the UK court system, you know, the judges are not excited about the idea that their decisions can be analyzed. I know that's ridiculous because we live in a precedent-based legal system, but the judges do not love the idea that all of their past decisions could be analyzed in this kind of statistical way. And so, you know, what has happened over the past 20 years is a very piecemeal approach to information that is fundamentally public domain information hitting the outside world. You know, we still in 2020 publish the daily cause lists, i.e., who is in court today. They either you either have to pay for them through a commercial organization which gets the data free from the court system, but then somehow charges people for it, or you go to a website where the data is published in pure flat HTML text and not structured and there's no database of it, so you have to scrape it, and then arguably, can you scrape it? Do you have the I mean, it's a very, very complex world. And so, you know, I have some sympathy as to why we're here, but I have no sympathy about the fact that we've spent 10 or 15 years talking about what needs to change and almost nothing has done. So it's frustrating. I mean, I will also point out that for you know, those of us that can navigate the system well, therefore you can make outsized gains, because it's not easy to do, but if you know what you're doing, then you can, if all the data, let me put it the other way, if all the data was being presented up beautifully, then everybody would be using it to make decisions. So it's, I don't mind, personally, I don't mind the fact from a Mishcon point of view that it's hard to do, because I think it's good for us, but if I put my sort of social hat on, it's outrageous that the data isn't available in much more freely, given that these are publicly funded court systems.
That's interesting, Nick. Given that the courts might be lagging in sort of adopting technology and then obviously gathering data and disseminating it, you know, have you seen that other forms of dispute resolution have embraced technology in an accelerated manner, particularly maybe during COVID-19? Is it arbitration, mediation? We've seen this in other jurisdictions. What has been the uptick, or how has that played out in the UK?
I'm mindful I've been hogging for a bit. Julia, Susan, one of you, any thoughts on that?
Susan?
In terms of the uptick of, do you mean this year? Sorry, I think, was that in this year, or what have we seen?
This year, yeah. In terms of online, if the courts have been lagging, have you seen more technology being used in the arbitration context per se?
Yeah, so what I will say is, because look, we fund in 17 different jurisdictions, so we have an amazing window on the world of how the court systems are going, and some of them have literally gone to sleep. It's extraordinary. I have been, and I know I'm biased because I just think our legal system is the best in the world, so I start from there. But I've been so impressed. I've got a number of friends who are judges at in employment tribunals, in companies' courts, and everywhere. And I have, you know, seen some of our cases online, and I've been so impressed with how they have just carried on and just adopted it in lightning time, and it's been absolutely brilliant. And they are also holding live hearings if they need to. I know there's some issues around accessibility, things like Grantham Inquiry carries on, etc., which is fantastic. So I think big high five for litigation in the UK and how well it has been conducted. When I look at, for example, Canada or the US or other places where they've got a massive backlog because they have not been able, because they simply lacked the kit to be able to do what they need to do to keep these hearings going. I know from friends who are arbitrators, those have gone broadly pretty well. And I think some of these dedicated arbitration centres, like Maxwell in Singapore or Hong Kong, and like the London Arbitration Centre and others in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, have done a brilliant job. DIFC, very set up for all of this, have done a fantastic job to enable things to keep going. And frankly, why not? And I hope one of the many good things, I have to look at the good things of this terrible year, are things like all the interlocutory hearings, which frankly do not need people to turn up in droves to court. The wanting to hear the witness evidence, the final hearing still remains very important. That's what people have missed the most, and they look forward to going back to that. But so many of these interlocutory hearings will just go. And in Hong Kong Arbitration Week, which was last week, I'm so glad I asked him and he said yes to do this year's Harbour Lecture, was one of the leading mediators, Bill Wood. And he said, I have conducted endless mediations so effectively using technology, which has been, he said, it's worked just incredibly well. So it's been not about necessarily the medium, i.e. mediation, arbitration, litigation. It's been about the country actually, and their ability to supply their judges with the kit, the access, the whatever. I mean, I've heard some amusing stories from friends, particularly in the employment tribunal, of some of the claimants taking this to the extreme. So they, in the middle of their hearing, they decided to go shopping at Asda, and they're there on or lighting up a cigarette in the middle of a hearing, and my friends who are judges saying, well, you wouldn't be allowed to smoke in court, so I'm afraid you're going to have to put that cigarette out. So there's some amusing tales that come out, but it's been fascinating to me to see how well, where it's been able to be used, technology has done for all of this.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Susan. That was a great analogy as well. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I would just like to ask you all one question to hopefully end on an optimistic note, and that is, what are you most excited about in your respective industries in the next 3 to 5 years? So perhaps, Julia, we start with you.
Gosh, what am I most excited about? I think COVID, for all of its horrors, in the legal space has created more of an urgency around, I don't want to say digitization, because who cares about digitization, but it's about doing things in a more effective way, which often involves an aspect of digitization. And I think in our space, just the barrier to entry has gotten lower, because law firms are more open-minded around adoption. And I think it's better, it's better for the end user, it's better for the consumers of legal services, it's better for law firms. And I think overall having a more efficient way to deliver legal services, a better way to deliver substantive legal services is so positive, broadly speaking. And I think COVID's accelerated that. So I think that's the optimistic note I would say.
Great, thanks, Julia. And Nick, what are you most excited about over the shortish term?
I think, giving a slightly technical answer, the breakthroughs that we've seen in natural language processing, machine learning or AI, but specifically focused on being able to understand text using machines, that the breakthroughs, the state of the art has moved forward faster in the last 12 months than probably the 10 years before that. And that's nothing to do with COVID. It just so happens that there have been some big breakthroughs. And if you look at what happened when sort of the computer vision, the same breakthroughs happened sort of 4 or 5 years ago, you look at what became possible as a result of that, I think we're going to see the application of different machine learning techniques to legal corpora, legal data, to be pretty extraordinary over the next 3 to 5 years, I think. So I think we'll be able to do many of the things that frankly, lots of people I work with think we can do now, and we're miles away from doing it. I think we'll be in a better place in 3 or 4 years' time because of the breakthroughs that are happening in research right now.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I realized we didn't even really do a deep dive into AI and NLP, so I guess we'll have to come back and revisit that one. And Susan, what are you most excited about in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so I think it's, for me, it's this ability, when it comes right back to it, law is the law, and then there's a lot of admin that goes around it. And too many of us who trained as lawyers spent too long proofreading documents or going through documents in a way that's actually A, quite boring on a long-term basis, and B, is not very efficient. And technology is better at all of those things. And I'm still amazed at how we're not as ahead as we might be, because most of us that became lawyers love it because we find it fascinating about how it applies to all these stories of what happens in people's lives. So I'm excited because I do think this year has caused us to make that big exponential step forward for the adoption of those things, and to get back to the heart of what we really like about our jobs, and therefore how we can best advise our clients. And that's where technology has such value. We see that on the class actions that we run and how we administer them, through to the budgeting of what we do. And I also hope that the more information we gather about costs, we can bring the cost of legal revision down. And that usually makes law partners and law firms go, oh, I don't like the sound of that, because that means they'll earn less. It won't, because if it means that you're able to focus on the stuff that you're really best at, you'll actually have a more interesting job, working on more cases, focusing on the heart of the issues, whilst all the rest of it is done by somebody else. And I don't actually think that profitability will go down. Finally, though, we've got to find a way to enable the young people coming into the profession, nonetheless, to keep learning. And that's one of the things that we have to be really conscious of, and how we make this work for them. It's all right for old lags like me. I've got an amazing network that I've been doing this a very long time. But being 22 or 3 right now, and how you develop those networks, that's incumbent on us to help them do so.
Fantastic. That's a great closing remark. I'm going to hand over to Dilip and Linda, but thank you. It's been fabulous. It's been one of my favorite panels thus far. So thank you so much for your time and thoughts today.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank our panelists. Thank you so much. This was really one of the most dynamic engagements that we've had with our audience, as well as the panelists. On that note, we still have questions that we weren't able to get to, so we may circulate those to you, and we will find a way to get those to the audience members. And I would actually like to thank, as always, Linda Fitzallen and the ADGM Arbitration Center, and hand it off to Linda for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Dilip. Just huge thanks, Julia, Susan, and Nick. That was an absolutely brilliant discussion, and going through all of those kind of hot topics and the points in particular that are kind of burning at the moment. If I could put a plug in for digital courts, that they are actually really working super hard and seamlessly through this pandemic. So as is the Arbitration Center and arbitration mediation in particular. But I think dispute resolution has had a circuit breaker with the pandemic, I think, and has really lifted its game. So that's interesting. But thank you so much for your time, expertise, and really insights into this topic. And thank you, Dilip and Rachel, enormously. So it's been a brilliant session. We are in a month's time home here in Abu Dhabi for the last of the editions of Knowledge Series 2020, where the ideas, the thoughts, and the concepts that we've gathered along the way through our world trip come together here with our local audience. So to our audience now, thank you so much for your participation, your questions, and the polling, your answers to the polling questions. Stay with us in a month's time for Back Home Here, and we wish you to stay safe and well. And again, thank you very much, Nick, Julia, and Susan. It's been brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.